Back in the day, they were all, people came up here, they were given 640 acres of land. They had to clear it. That was part of the Robinson Act. They had to clear it. And they got very wealthy people because of the dairy industry and the cream. We had a creamery sat out at opposite Dorothy Range Road. I mean, we had a golf course. We had, we had this billiard hall. In the 20s, this town was booming, and it was big and it was booming. The dairy industry died, and the town died with it. I think the rot started to set in during the Depression, and it never actually bounced back until basically now. I know in the 70s I've heard a lot of people say how desperate, how bad it was. And I mean, these people have been here all their lives, and they said it was really bad in the 70s. You have other towns that come and go. Like some towns, they boom and they bust, and they boom and they bust. But that was the reason why here. They had very wealthy, and now they've gone from dairy farms to macadamia nuts, and you've got the wealth back in again. It was a very self-sufficient. That was the major town for the area. I mean, we had 5 banks, 2 hotels. Now we've got no banks and 1 hotel.
In the 60s, it was dying. Empty shops, people living in the shop fronts, and that should have been the end of Bangalow, but something happened. Tell me what. The town had people who quite proudly say that they wouldn't be where they are today unless they'd stolen their first calf. Just too many of those people. They're all pleasant people, but not entirely honest. But open, good people to be with.
When I came in '72, I was told it was a dying town. Closed shops mainly, a few open desultory stuff. I mean, a cup of coffee came out of a bottle that they poured into, you had a milk coffee, mostly milk, and then there's chicory essence. And the difference now, of course, with 5 coffee shops that side and 4 this side, but mainly closed shops. You probably could have bought the whole town for $10,000, and I didn't because I didn't have $10,000. I lived on the beach, and the cyclones of '72 took my house and left me with furniture that I need to put in storage. A friend said you could rent a shop in Bangalow, a big space, for $10, and storage cost $20. So I put my furniture in a shop in Bangalow and walked away. Then the owner of the shop said, I don't want to rent it anymore. You can buy it. how much? Oh, 2,000? 1,500. I later found that there were rates owing of 1,500, which he had to pay. So we bought just the original shop, a butcher shop, for $2,000. And then I asked my neighbour to the east, Cole Barnes, if I could park my car on his land. He said, "It's your land." I said, "How's that? Right up to there is yours. You bought that too, and all the way back there." Oh. So good neighbours, Cole Barnes, across the road, Ben Hall and Marge Hall, and up the road, because Ben Hall was both sides of the road. We had all services, mortuary, coffin makers, carpenters.
In 1907, all the shops were all single-storey little wooden things, and from where the kitchen shop is now to the Station Street burnt down in 1907. A bakery caught fire. Then the top half caught fire. In 1939, when the pub burnt to the ground, the Granuale, it took George Reading's shop across the road, and it took the bank.
Harry Fowler was, of Fowler's Lane, was the great storyteller of his day, and would tell wonderful gossipy tales about grumpy old second-hand dealers, and this is from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And one of his favourites, he told me, was on this site, was the Bangalow Herald, where we are now. And one night on his way home, he noticed smoke coming out of the place and looked in the window and saw a fire, a small fire. So he broke in and extinguished the fire, and next morning came back to get his reward, which he thought would be at least a tanner, sixpence. Got a clip round the ear and told, if he saw a fire there again, leave it alone. And next week the place burned down.
We lived up top of the hill for 5 years, and then the old Baker residence, which well, that required evicting Doug Ryan. But Doug couldn't be evicted because he was the best fast bowler that Bangalow Cricket Club had. So even when my father bought the house, Doug stayed on as long as he wanted because he was the best bowler in the team. So somewhere in the 60s we moved down there. Town was dying.
We were a town divided by the highway, and people were stopped for cigarettes and alcohol to keep them driving and keep them awake, they thought, and petrol. And there were 4 petrol stations.
First of all, we rented a shop, Bill Malick's shop was a grocery store in the main street, and after a little while there was a shop for sale on the corner which is now burnt down, and we bought this shop and divided it into a grocery shop. We had an office for a doctor, and in the front we had a pinball parlour. When we were here there was quite a lot of hippies. The shop near us was a restaurant owned by the hippies, and they used to bring us grandma pie to eat, and they were lovely people.
I came to Bangalow in the '74 flood. We actually got as far as Coffs Harbour and had to stay there for a couple of days because of the big flood. And we arrived, went to live at Kurrabell. Floods were always a big part of Bangalow. The roads around leading into Bangalow and out of Bangalow were very low in those days, so often a radio the call would come over the radio to say that Bangalow was completely cut off and there were trucks and cars in Bangalow, and would people bring in bedding and food. It was a very regular thing in those days.
When I first came to Bangalow, I came up to visit my friend Vivian, who worked at the mobile service station up in Granville Road. And I was on a holiday to stay here for 1 week, and then I was going to Brisbane for a week to visit another girlfriend, and then across to Darwin to see another friend. I ended up staying in Bangalow and didn't go any further with the holiday. And so I bought a house out at Knockrow. I eventually went back to Sydney, and then one day I'm sitting on the train going across to Pendle Hill where I worked, and I thought, this is insane. Why am I on this train travelling all this way to go to work when I have this beautiful house up at Knockrow? So I went home and just made a plan to get back up here. Nothing much changed. It was still sort of a very sad little town with not a lot of employment and everything going on. So the Splinters Cafe happened to be on the market. So because I'd had some experience in the food industry, I decided to purchase the cafe and therefore have some employment so I could move here.
Okay, in 1988, I came to Bangalow as an apprentice, worked here, done my terms. There was people involved in the shop, the Bisson family that owned it all. They sold the business to people in Sydney, which they had a good go at the town and didn't make a very good job of it. They went bankrupt, which made me take over the freehold in the business sector of the Bangalow butchery.
When I first started my shop in Bangalow, I had moved here from Terania Creek, I think in 1985 or so. And I can't remember the strict circumstances. A friend of mine and I got together and we decided to have a little an art gallery there. And I was a collector of antiques and early Australian furniture and things like that. So I put a few pieces in. We started it off as the Bangalow Gallery. And I started to sell some antiques, and that angle took off more.
Clientele back in the 80s were just the farmers, beef producers, mango, banana farmers and all that we had around here. They've all moved away now and gone. Town was on that decline of business. We did occasionally sneak across to the hotel and have a beer at the front steps of the hotel and keep an eye on the business, and hopefully a client will walk in, so we'd run across the road and look after them.
I remember one cafe, which was Fisher's Cafe. I'm sure, there was the bakery, Anthony's Bakery.
Yeah.
But I can remember, I probably shouldn't mention this.
Kathy Fisher.
Yeah, they were lovely, lovely people, but all you could get was, I think, a steak sandwich. Probably that coffee you talked about. That wasn't real coffee.
We used to call it salmonella sandwiches and botulism burgers.
I moved to Bangalow in about 1992. I'm not completely sure, but around that era. I guess I came up to Bangalow because I wanted to break from city life, and I was aware of the village over many years. I'd actually had dinner in Jeannot's, the French restaurant, which was the building that I eventually ended up buying, and I moved there and bewildered a lot of the local residents because I opened up a Japanese antique shop, and at that time there was only a traditional antique shop up the road, and there was Mickey across the road, and there's Abracadabra was there, and that's always been there as long as I can ever remember, and that was it, and it was a pretty daring thing to do. Oh, it was a pretty quiet village. Not much happened there. There was Wendy from Splinters. I always remember Wendy had a complaint sign if you had complaints, and there was a rat trap on the actual counter. And if you had a complaint and you put it on the rat trap, it would take your hand off. So
you could shoot a gun off in the main street on Sunday. The trucks came through, about 300 trucks a day. It was difficult to cross the road. But it did have it had a wilder atmosphere. It was nothing to see fights in full swing coming out of the pub doors and that sort of thing. The people were lovely, a lot of characters, just a wonderful place. I thought it was an ideal spot for a gallery. No, Barebones is fairly well known. We had to choose a name that was high up in the alphabet, knowing about the computer business, but also we called it Barebones because basically we started on the bones of our arse.
And I've just come across these articles on festivals in the town of Bangalow, and I've come across one here that I was quite amazed by. A festival was trying to be organised, and it was called Bangalow Dreaming, and it was to be a night of music, poetry, dance, cultural council of Dream Up a festival, and at the Bangalow Scout Hall and Showgrounds. And then I found all these news articles, which I find a bit hard to believe, saying that fears for Bangalow Festival, about there being a gathering of black magic and witchcraft and demonic child dedication ceremonies, earth worship, and they didn't want us to turn into another Nimbin with scruffy long-haired hippies sleeping in doorways and parks. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this must have been right back in the 30s. And when I looked at the date, it was 1991.
Well, the first thing they did was upgrade Byron Street to highway standard. And they spent millions of dollars building that concrete road out there. And then, of course, they went and bypassed us. So having first upgraded the highway with I observed about 3 metres of concrete, enormous amount of concrete went into the main street. And at one stage it started sliding down the hill because there was too much of it and not enough reinforcing.
One of the loveliest things about the shop I rented, which was where Browerbirds now is, it was the old ES&A Bank, I think. And in the wintertime, it's the only shop in the entire town still, I think, that has a little sunny platform in the winter, you know. And I got quite a high profile in the town because I used to spend a lot of time sitting out on that little deck reading the Sydney Morning Herald in the sun and being able to say hello to people, you know. And it was really lovely. And what I had a lot of fun doing, which I don't think a lot of other people might have had fun doing, was watching the 26-wheelers overtake each other in the main street, you know, and scraping the awnings of the overhanging awnings on the shops, you know.
And it was a pretty narrow street, and semi-trailers used to go up there all day, all night, and they'd come back again from Brisbane, and it felt like a war zone. The buildings used to shake, and it was terribly noisy and all of that. And to such an extent that the original Federation buildings, a lot of the verandas had been taken off because they were too dangerous overhanging the footpath with all of these huge semi-trailers travelling through the town.
The RTA, or whatever they were called then, came and said there was going to be a bypass, what do we think? And we started saying we want this and we want that. He said, oh no, you're getting it. This is just a formality. This community consultation is a whole new thing for us. And that's what's going to happen. And you better think about what that's going to what it mean to you. When I came in '72, I was told it was a dying town. Why are you here? This town is dying. So that was the option in the 90s. We were going to die again.
When our family took over the post office in 1994, the bypass was just about to open. And we had what seemed to be a really worried community. Many people thought they were going to lose the post office, or at least have a much reduced level of service. And everybody was worried about the effects on business. I don't think anybody really knew just what was going to actually happen to this town.
So then we produced the Bangalow TV commercial with a jingle in those days, featuring every business in town who was prepared to give us $50.
And people had time.
So that was our contribution, and then various groups sprung up to make the main street more attractive.
We unanimously agreed as a chamber that Bangalow belonged as a federation village. That was its history, and in order to get people to come there, we needed to keep that heritage, that federation there in the village. It made the village attractive and very beautiful. I eventually went down on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce to the RTA down in Grafton, and there we got permission to put some blisters out on the street, and we got permission to plant the town out with Bangalow palms. I was out there for the first 2 years watering them every night to get them growing, and it started to develop a real charm.
I had my shop here before the bypass, during the bypass and after the bypass. Before that, it was very, very noisy in the street. The whole street would rattle, your shops would rattle. It was hard to get across the road. It was just pretty horrendous, all those big trucks sort of coming down. And then the bypass happened, and that was a real turning point for Bangalow. But of course, for the first maybe 6 months, it was very quiet.
But when the bypass finally opened, we found we had a large declining clientele. We went for that for about 18 months. The town did, declined at 60%, we went down.
Unfortunately for me, it affected my business in quite severely because we missed out on a lot of the passing traffic, like morning teas, afternoon teas, but I was very lucky that I had a very strong local clientele, which kept us going until things managed to pick themselves up again, which was probably a good 12 months, maybe a bit longer.
The town then was a very small, quiet community, but overwhelmingly you felt really, really supported by everybody from the town. They really wanted to, welcome a new business, and they thought it was a great thing for the town.
We had a lot of fun in those days, and we also had to try to get people to Bangalow. It's such a pretty little place, and Bangalow's saving grace, I feel, is that nobody wanted Bangalow. They all wanted Byron Bay or something a bit flasher. And Bangalow was a bit of a backwater for many years, so it was just wonderful. Business-wise, it was pretty hard. So Tony Jones was the instigator of the Billy Cart Derby.
But one of the things that really celebrated the bypass over the years that I had been there, people were talking about the Billy Cart Derby, and it would be great to have a Billy Cart Derby in Bangalow. And that but never happened. So what happened was after the bypass, we decided to get the Billy Cart Derby happening. It was interesting because we had no idea really about, insurance, about specifications of billy carts, and it was a bit of a free-for-all. The town was absolutely jam-packed. One particular competitor represented a roof truss company from Byron Bay, and no kidding, the billy cart was as big as a bathroom. It was all made of hardwood timber, and it was like a semi-trailer on 4 little Victor Mower wheels, and it came tearing down the street, and as it was going from the pub down near Station Street, the next minute I noticed that the billy cart was veering into Station Street, and the finish line was actually down past the fire station, and there were a couple of hundred people in Station Street, and You know, I just thought there's going to be people killed here because I don't know how nobody got hurt.
Following the bypass and the success of the billy cart derby, people soon worked out Bangalow was a pretty good place to do business and to run an event.
There's been starlight festivals, fatherhood festivals, which all came about through the renovation of the A&I hall, which has all brought a different sort of person into town. A lot of trippers from the Gold Coast and that all come to these festivals. I used to do my windows up at Splinters at Christmas time and had all the windows all done up with all the thousands of lights, and people used to come from all over the place to have a look at it. I used to laugh because Alma and myself and Vivian would be down there at 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning being so meticulous about these windows. I'd be running across out in the middle of the road with the thumbs up or the thumbs down and all this, and Mr. Wilson Draper would be across the road thinking, what are those girls doing? They're absolutely mad, running around over there at this hour of the night. They used to pull up in the middle of the night and set their photos, and from that they decided that maybe the whole street should participate. So we went around and got all the shops to go out and buy fairy lights, and we went around and decorated them all up, and then we had a beautiful opening over in the Heritage Park at the Fire Station Park and had a few drinks and all turned our lights on at the same time. Then we had our the garden club. Mrs. Avery used to walk around all the shops and we all had to participate in the garden competition and we'd all do our windows up. There was a very strong competition going on between myself and the post office. But yeah, we all used to run around and run up and down the street looking at each other's window and helping each other with designs and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. The Bass Film Festival used to be here and the shops all got together and they do their windows and everything all up for the film festival. Yeah, so we were all a very hands-on, very fun. We all looked after each other. Another issue that I can remember sitting through all the controversy was our red phone boxes in town. Telstra wanted to take away the phone boxes and that caused a big kerfuffle in town with the Chamber of Commerce and the Historical Society. It would have been a shame to see them go because they just looked to be in the right place with the sort of village that we were with, the Heritage Village.
It's time to pull my belly in.
It's the characters and the stories that tell you the most about what kind of place Bangalow was.
My father began with feed and grain. He was down beside Sis Gray, down beside Billy Solway. When he bought that shop, it was a cafe. And over a period of years, he and Stan Crouch and a couple of other locals ripped the bedrooms out and turned it into a shop. He got his auctioneer's licence, got a real estate licence, got a concession for bus tickets, selling bread, fruit and veg because there were 6 of us kids that had to be fed and it was a cheap way of doing it. We got the leftovers. He probably had a few other businesses too, I think. It was nobody quite knew what Wilson Draper was going to be selling. They always knew where he'd be sitting. He sat in the same spot for 20 years.
Mr. Draper was the unofficial mayor of Bangalow. Absolutely delightful man, who I think I was paying $50 a week rent, and I paid $50 a week rent for all the time I was there. Once I asked him, I thought I'd get a 3-by-3 year lease, you know, and I said to Mr. Draper, how about I get a lease? And he said, righto. So I went to the newsagents or the real estates and I got this whopping great 40-page lease document, you know, and Mr. Draper flicked through it and he said, oh, just get it back down to 1 page if you could, you know. So I had a lease with him that said pretty much that I would pay the rent, and if it leaked, Mr. Draper would fix the roof, you know, that was it. And I said to him, Mr. Draper, I've been paying you $50 a week all this time. How about next year I give you 60 and the year after 70 and the year after that 80, you know, for the term of my lease? And he sort of stroked his chin and he goes, Oh, I think we'd better just leave it at the one number. You know, he was absolutely beautiful. He said, famously, he said, I'd just like to see a cove have a go. You know, and that was the spirit of the town in those days.
As I said before, when I first came to Bangalow, people were somewhat bewildered by me opening up a Japanese antique shop with Stephen, and you know, I used to often get glares from dear old Wilson Draper from across the road. I always remember him coming down and opening the shop of a morning, and the smells that came across the road from the vegetables that had been sitting in the shop for some time was something of a different experience. And yeah, I think some people could never cope with the fact that we were somewhat changing the village slowly, maybe too quickly.
There was another fellow by the name of Alan that used to come, loved getting all dressed up, and I can remember my first introduction to him when he came bouncing into the shop, and he was the loveliest of fellas, and he had this full wedding gown on. And I actually didn't know, I was a bit shocked at first, but as I got to know him, he was a wonderful character. He'd come in his 1950s outfits and his nice little shorts and bikini tops and everything.
I remember Marge Hall very well. She was one of the very first that I met when I came to Bangalow. She had her little tiny weeny Esso garage where the bottle shop is now, and across the road where the building society is, Benny, her husband, had Benny's museum. Benny used to go up to the pub in the afternoons with his big dog called Esso. It was a big German Shepherd, and Marge would drink down at the bowling club. So there were lots of identities in town. They were certainly the first people that I met here.
Back in the 90s, we used to have a local constable, and his name was Glenn Campbell. Not the Rydstone cowboy we know of, but he's the local constable that occasionally enjoyed playing polo-cross and taking the horse for a ride up the main street. One evening he decided he'd make another move towards the hotel and making the horse walk in through the front doors of the hotel. As the horse came in the floor with shoes on, panicked, and the horse went down on all fours on his back, and it just kicked the shit out of the hotel. A local man called Paul George was involved in actually holding the horse down and getting the rider out away from the horse, and then settling the horse down to try and work another system of how to get the horse back out of the hotel, which they end up doing by trying to get the saddle and the stirrups through the door, which did not quite fit. And to this day you can still see the stirrup marks on the side of the doors when the horse and the stirrups were still going.
But there are certainly characters in Bangalow, and you know, a lot of good people, and a lot of very open-minded people. The CWA, you know, they were right behind everything, you know, and they've always been a credit to the village. And some of the women that have passed on in that, like dear old Thelma Kirkland, you know, they were beautiful people, and they were in there to support everything.
This particular branch, believe it or not, has gone from having about 20 to 25 members to about 65 members. And things are, everyone wants to be a part of the Bangalow scene too, because it's well situated, it's active, there are people in here every day doing things. The younger women can still learn things from the older women, and the older women have got to learn to accept the younger women too. They all yearn for the days when scones and jam and cream and put on your best clothes to go down the street was the way to go. The values haven't changed, and the dedication hasn't changed. The country still needs people to put in time to make money for those worthwhile causes of women, children, health, education, any of the social issues.
Yeah, I still remember the days the schoolgirls used to line up at the front door at 5 o'clock.
To make things happen, you've got to work hard to make them happen. But it's really important for businesses to be united, to meet regularly, and to charter the future, to pave the way, and never to forget the past. That's the most important thing, and always keep in mind our history and our story, and you know, Bangalow will stay on the right track, I'm sure.
Bangalow has a heart and soul. I've lived in a few other towns and they're nice, but they don't have the heart and soul of helping each other, looking out for each other. It's a very lovely community.
Bangalow is very much becoming a destination. You know, new businesses are being attracted here, which is, you know, in the role of the Chamber of Commerce, we have to be part of that. That gives the longevity of the town. But at the same time, you've got to retain that heritage feel. You've got to be proud of what we've got and hang on to that with everything that we have. But at the same time, not discourage new business, because that new blood is what will keep Bangalow going. New ideas, you've got to accept new ideas, providing the new ideas are within the parameters of what the village expects, being the people that live here, and indeed the businesses that spend money and invest in the area to put businesses here. If any new idea works in within that, well then we've got to run with it. Otherwise it'll die like a lot of other little towns. I mean, Karen and I, you know, both had experience with little country towns in the West, and they die because they don't think forward enough to save their towns. But Bangalow's so lucky because we do have the gateway. Byron Bay is our gateway, but it's not our nemesis at the same time. It is what it is.
The heroes in this story are the original residents who had to endure the invasion of us well-intentioned newbies who thought the town needed improving. In some ways it probably did, but I think we all learnt that we had a lot to learn from the people who built the community in the first place. It's often said that the town was dying, and economically it probably was. But in spirit, I think it's the richest town on earth.
Many of my old friends have gone, they disappeared years ago, but their families are still friends of mine. And I've made wonderful friends of some of the newcomers to the district. I pay tribute to them. We've got some wonderful people come into the area during the last 2 or 3 years. They diversified from the dairy into fruit growing and other matters. But as far as Nellie and I are concerned, we've been treated real as royalties for most years.